Wife shocked by fire chief husband's sick confession true crime cases. The perfect life. Emily Carter always believed her life was perfect. Married to Michael Carter, the town's respected fire chief, their relationship had always been the envy of their small, tight-knit community. Michael was dependable, heroic, and adored by everyone in town. Their two-story colonial home in the quiet suburbs radiated peace and stability. It was the house where they raised their two children, now grown and off to college. From the outside, they seemed like the perfect couple, she a local schoolteacher, he the protector of the town. But cracks had started to form in recent months. Michael had become distant, withdrawn even. He was always tired and had a perpetual look of worry in his eyes. Emily assumed it was just the stress of the job. Fighting fires and saving lives was bound to wear on someone over time. Still, it had been more than stress. There were late-night phone calls he brushed off, unexplained absences, and strange interactions with his colleagues. Emily's unease grew, but she never dared question him. One evening, while they sat in the living room watching the news, a report flashed about a fire in a nearby town. A local family had died in the blaze: mother, father, and two young children. The house was reduced to ashes within minutes. The news anchor's voice echoed in the room as Emily watched, horrified. That fire spread so quickly, she said quietly, glancing at Michael, whose jaw was tight. It's tragic. Did you hear about it at the station? Michael didn't respond immediately. His eyes were glued to the screen, but there was something in his posture that unsettled her. It wasn't just sadness, there was something darker in his expression, as if he recognized something she couldn't see. Yeah, he finally said, his voice hoarse. We, heard about it. Something in his tone made Emily sit up straighter. She felt a sudden chill in the room, though the fireplace crackled just a few feet away. Michael? She prodded, her heart beginning to race. What is it? You seem off. He stood up abruptly, pacing the room. It's nothing, Emily. Just work stuff. You wouldn't understand. Her stomach dropped. I might if you talked to me. He shot her a look, something she'd never seen in him before, an edge of fear. Or was it guilt? For the rest of the evening, Michael remained distant. Emily felt a growing knot in her chest, unable to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The news report kept playing in her mind, the image of the charred remains of the house, the small children who hadn't made it out. She had a sinking feeling that Michael knew more about it than he let on. That night, Emily lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Michael slept soundly beside her, but his breathing was irregular. She turned over to look at him, feeling her heart pound against her ribs. He looked different in the dim light, his face hardened, a man she didn't fully recognize. What was he hiding? A burning secret. The following morning, Michael left for work early, but not before giving Emily a kiss on the cheek, as if nothing had changed. Emily watched him go with a mixture of confusion and dread. She couldn't shake the feeling from last night. Something was wrong, and her husband was involved. At school, she found it impossible to focus. Her students' voices faded into the background as her mind kept replaying the news report. By lunchtime, she made a decision. She needed answers. That afternoon, she drove to the fire station. She knew most of the firefighters well, as Michael often invited them over for barbecues and gatherings. When she walked through the doors, she was greeted by Rick, one of Michael's closest colleagues. Hey, Emily. What brings you here? Rick smiled warmly, but there was a flicker of tension in his eyes. I just thought I'd surprise Michael, Emily said casually, glancing around the station. Is he around? Rick shifted uncomfortably. He's out on a call right now. Something minor, but, should be back soon. Something about Rick's body language made her uneasy. He was too quick to avoid eye contact, and his hands fidgeted nervously. Oh, she said, forcing a smile. Well, I'll wait. I wanted to ask him about that fire in the news last night. The one that killed that poor family. Did you hear about it? Rick froze. His eyes flickered with something. Was it fear? He hesitated before responding. Yeah, we all heard about it. Tragic stuff. Fires like that they're unpredictable. Emily's heart raced. There was something in his voice that confirmed her suspicions. These men knew more than they were letting on. I just can't imagine what it must have been like, she pressed, her voice shaky. How does a fire like that spread so fast? Was there anything unusual about it? Rick opened his mouth to respond, but just then, Michael walked through the door. His eyes widened in surprise when he saw Emily. Emily? What are you doing here? He asked, his voice a little too forced. Emily swallowed hard, her throat dry. I wanted to see you. I was just talking to Rick about that fire from last night. Michael shot Rick a warning look, and Rick quickly excused himself, leaving them alone. Emily's pulse quickened. Why was Michael acting so strange? Let's go home, Michael said, his tone cold.
Now.
As they drove back in silence, Emily's mind raced. The tension between them was suffocating. She tried to think of the right words, but the closer they got to home, the more she realized that her suspicions were only growing. Something inside her screamed that her husband was hiding a terrible secret. When they finally pulled into their driveway, Michael turned off the car and gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. Emily could see the battle raging within him. I need to tell you something, he said quietly, his voice trembling. Emily felt her heart drop into her stomach. This was at the moment everything would change. She braced herself, knowing that whatever came next would shatter her world forever. What is it? She whispered, barely able to breathe. Michael looked straight ahead, unable to meet her eyes. That fire, the one that killed that family, he said, his voice breaking. I wasn't just a witness. Emily felt the ground shift beneath her. The weight of his words crushed her chest, making it impossible to breathe. What are you saying, Michael? He finally turned to face her, his eyes filled with guilt and horror. I started it. The confession. Emily felt as though the air had been sucked from the car. Her mind struggled to grasp the words she had just heard. The world outside the windshield seemed to blur as her vision tunneled, focusing only on Michael, whose face was contorted with guilt and fear. You what? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Michael's breathing quickened, and he closed his eyes, as if hoping that by not seeing her, he could escape the reality of what he had just confessed. But there was no escape now. I started that fire, he repeated, this time louder, the words like stones dropping into a deep, dark well. I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt. It was supposed to be a small fire, just a scare. But it got out of control. Emily's hands trembled. She gripped the car door, her knuckles turning white as shock gave way to disbelief. How? How could you do something like that, Michael? What were you thinking? He hung his head, staring down at the steering wheel, his hands trembling. I wasn't thinking, Emily. That's the truth. I was desperate. I owed money more than I could ever pay back. I thought I could make it look like an accident, maybe even get the insurance payout for the building. He looked at her, his eyes pleading. I didn't know there were people inside. I swear I didn't know. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to make sense of what he was saying. The image of the burned house flashed in her mind, the family, the children, all gone in a horrific inferno. She felt sick, as if the very ground beneath her feet was crumbling. Michael, that family, they're dead, she said, her voice shaking. You killed them. I didn't mean to, Michael said again, his voice cracking. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. Why didn't you stop it? You're a firefighter. You could have. I tried. He shouted, slamming his hands against the steering wheel, his face twisted in agony. I tried to stop it, but by the time I got back, it was too late. The flames were everywhere. I couldn't get in. I couldn't save them. Emily's head spun, and she felt the bile rise in her throat. She shoved the car door open, gasping for air as she stumbled out onto the driveway. Her knees buckled, and she leaned against the side of the car, trying to steady herself. Michael got out and hurried to her side, reaching for her, but she recoiled from his touch. Don't, she shouted, her voice raw with emotion. Don't touch me. How could you do this? How could you keep this from me? Tears streamed down Michael's face, and he looked at her with the desperation of a man drowning in guilt. I didn't know what to do, Emily. I was scared. I thought I could cover it up, that no one would ever know. Emily stared at him, her chest heaving with a mixture of anger, grief, and horror. The man standing before her, the man she had loved for years, was now a stranger, someone capable of unspeakable actions. "There's no covering this up," she said, her voice shaking. "People are dead, Michael. A family. Because of you." Michael's face crumpled, and he sank to his knees on the gravel driveway. "I know," he sobbed. "I know I'm a monster. I don't deserve forgiveness. But I couldn't carry it anymore, Emily. I had to tell you. I had to tell someone." Emily backed away, her mind racing. The enormity of what he had done crashed over her, wave after wave. What was she supposed to do? Call the police? Turn in her own husband? The father of her children? She couldn't think. She couldn't breathe. Without another word, she turned and bolted toward the house, her feet pounding the pavement as adrenaline coursed through her veins. Behind her, Michael's anguished cries echoed in the night, but she didn't stop. She couldn't face him, not now. Once inside, she slammed the door behind her and locked it, her heart pounding. She leaned against the door, sliding down until she was sitting on the floor, gasping for breath. Her mind was spinning with 1,000 thoughts, none of them coherent. She needed to think. She needed to figure out what to do. But all she could hear were Michael's words repeating in her head. "I started that fire." Unraveling the truth. For hours, Emily sat on the floor, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. What was she supposed to do now? She couldn't just pretend she didn't know the truth. But the idea of turning Michael and of seeing him hauled away in handcuffs was almost too much to bear. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a text from her sister, Beth. "Hey, just checking in. How are you and Michael doing? Let's catch up soon." Emily stared at the message, her hands trembling. She felt like she was living in an alternate reality. How could she respond to something so normal when her entire world had just been turned upside down? She quickly turned off her phone, throwing it aside. This wasn't the time for small talk. She needed to figure out her next move. But first she needed answers. Emily's mind raced as she paced the living room. There had to be more to the story. Michael had confessed to starting the fire. But why? And how deep did his lies go? Was there more he wasn't telling her? Unable to stay still any longer, she marched upstairs to their bedroom, where she knew Michael kept his personal belongings, his wallet, his phone, and other things he thought she didn't look through. She hated snooping, but at this point, she had no choice. She rummaged through his drawers, her heart racing as she searched for anything that might explain why her husband had done something so terrible. In the bottom of the drawer, beneath a pile of old clothes, she found a small, locked box she had never seen before. Her breath caught in her throat. She knew it wasn't right to pry, but after everything she had learned tonight, she couldn't ignore it. She grabbed the box and took it downstairs, searching for something to break the lock. With a few determined hits from a hammer, the lock snapped, and the box popped open. Inside was a collection of papers, bills, letters, and photographs. Emily's heart sank as she sifted through them, her eyes widening with horror at what she saw. The photos were of the family that had died in the fire. Emily stared at the photographs in disbelief, her hands trembling as she held them up to the dim light of the living room. Each picture showed the same family, a husband, a wife, and 2 young children. The smiling faces seemed hauntingly familiar, but seeing them now, in this hidden box among Michael's things, filled her with an overwhelming sense of dread. Her mind raced as she flipped through the images, her heart pounding with each one. They weren't just random pictures. They looked personal, intimate. The family was pictured at a park, playing with their children, at a barbecue, and even at a birthday party. The more she looked, the clearer it became. Michael knew these people. But how? Why did he have these photos? And why were they hidden away, as though he was keeping them a secret? She felt a wave of nausea rising in her throat. The reality of the situation was starting to come together, and it was even worse than she had imagined. Michael hadn't just accidentally set fire to a building that happened to be occupied. No, it was more deliberate than that. This family was important to him, but in what way? And what had driven him to such a drastic and devastating act? Emily's hands shook as she pulled out a few more papers from the box. There were legal documents, all dating back several years. As she scanned through them, her blood turned cold. One document was a restraining order. It was against Michael. The name of the woman on the order, Anna Grayson, jumped out at her like a punch to the gut. The wife from the photographs. The woman who, along with her family, had perished in the fire. Emily's vision blurred as she tried to make sense of the words in front of her. Anna Grayson had taken out a restraining order against Michael.
Why?
Emily's mind raced, piecing together bits of a puzzle she hadn't even known existed. She sat back, her breath shallow. What had Michael done to this woman? What was their connection? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the porch. She jumped up, her heart pounding in her chest as she rushed to hide the papers and photos back in the box, shoving it under the couch just as the front door opened. Michael stood in the doorway, his face pale and haggard. His eyes were bloodshot, his shoulders slumped. He looked like a man who had just faced a ghost, and in some ways, Emily supposed he had. He shut the door quietly, as if not wanting to disturb the fragile tension that now hung in the air between them. Emily stood frozen in place, her back to the couch where she had just hidden the evidence of his lies. "I'm sorry," Michael whispered, his voice hoarse and broken. "I had to tell you. I couldn't live with it anymore." Emily didn't respond right away. Her thoughts were tangled, her emotions a chaotic storm of rage, betrayal, and deep sorrow. She couldn't look at him the same way now, not after everything she had just discovered. The man standing before her wasn't just guilty of setting a fire. He was hiding something far more sinister. "Why did you do it?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What was your connection to them, Michael?"
To that family?
Michael flinched as if she had struck him, his face paling even further. He didn't answer immediately, instead rubbing a hand over his face, his eyes squeezed shut. "I knew them," he finally admitted, his voice so soft she almost couldn't hear him. "I knew Anna. We were involved years ago, before you and I met." Emily's stomach twisted. She had suspected there was a connection, but hearing him say it aloud felt like a betrayal she wasn't prepared for. "Involved? What do you mean, Michael?" she asked, her voice shaking with a mix of fury and disbelief. Michael's shoulders slumped, and he sat down heavily on the edge of the couch, his head in his hands. "It was a long time ago, Emily. I was young, reckless. We were in a relationship, but it ended badly. She didn't want anything to do with me after that. When she got married and had kids, I tried to move on. But things between us didn't end well." Emily took a step back, feeling like the ground was crumbling beneath her feet. She felt the walls of her house, her life, closing in on her. "What did you do to her, Michael? Why was there a restraining order against you?" Michael's head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock. "You found that?" "I found everything," Emily said, her voice cold. "I found the photos, the restraining order. All of it." "What did you do?" Tears filled Michael's eyes as he seemed to crumble under the weight of his confession. "I didn't hurt her, Emily. I swear I didn't. I was obsessed. I couldn't let her go, and I made a mistake. I stalked her. I showed up at her house, her work. She was scared, and she filed the order to keep me away." Emily felt like she was in a nightmare she couldn't wake from. She had been living with a man she didn't even know. "And you set the fire. You did it because of her." Michael shook his head violently.
No,
that wasn't it. I swear to God, I didn't mean for them to die. I thought I was over her, I thought I had moved on, but when I saw her again, all those feelings came back. I don't know what I wanted. Maybe I thought if I scared them, if I showed her I still had power over her, she would." His voice broke, and he buried his face in his hands, sobbing. Emily's chest tightened as the full horror of the situation sank in. This wasn't just about an affair. This was about control, obsession, and now death. The room felt suffocating. Emily couldn't stand to be near him anymore. Without saying another word, she turned and fled upstairs, her mind reeling. She had to leave. She couldn't stay here, not with him. Not with this monster. But as she packed her bags, she knew the nightmare was far from over. The past comes back to haunt. As Emily sat on the edge of the bed, her hastily packed suitcase lying open next to her, she tried to steady her breathing. Her hands trembled, and she struggled to think clearly. What should she do next? Should she go to the police? Should she run? The silence in the house was unbearable. Michael was still downstairs, probably still sitting on the couch, drowning in his guilt. But Emily didn't care anymore. He had crossed a line that she could never forgive. He had confessed to a crime that had torn apart the lives of an innocent family. Emily's mind raced as she sat on the edge of the bed, gripping the handle of her suitcase so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her heart pounded against her chest, the weight of everything she had just learned pressing down on her like a vice. The memories of Michael's confession replayed in her head, each word cutting deeper than the last. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, jarring her from the spiral of thoughts. She stared at the screen, blinking back tears. It was her best friend, Sarah. She hesitated for a moment before answering, unsure if she was ready to speak about the nightmare she had just uncovered. "Hey, Sarah's familiar voice came through the line, sounding light and unaware of the storm raging in Emily's life. "I was just thinking about you. How are you doing?" Emily's throat tightened, and she fought to keep her voice steady. I'm not okay, Sarah. Something happened." There was a pause on the other end, and Sarah's tone shifted immediately. "What's going on? Are you all right? Did something happen with Michael?" Emily swallowed hard, the knot in her stomach twisting tighter. "I don't even know where to start. He confessed something to me tonight, something horrible. And I found these photos, these documents." "Photos? What kind of photos?" "Emily, you're scaring me." Taking a shaky breath, Emily recounted everything: Michael's affair, the restraining order, the hidden photos of the family that had perished in the fire. She explained how the pieces fit together in a way she wished they didn't, how Michael's obsession had spiraled into something dark and deadly. When she finished, the silence on the other end was deafening. "Emily," Sarah finally whispered, her voice laced with shock and disbelief, "you need to get out of there."
Right now.
"I'm packing my bags," Emily said, her voice cracking. "But I don't know where to go. I don't know what to do. I feel like everything I've ever known is a lie." "Come to my place," Sarah urged. "We can figure everything out from here. But you cannot stay in that house with him. Not after what he's done." Emily nodded, even though Sarah couldn't see her. It was the most rational suggestion, but her legs felt like lead. She felt paralyzed by the enormity of what was happening. Leaving meant truly accepting that her husband was a monster. "I'll be there soon," Emily managed to say, her voice weak. She hung up the phone, her hands still shaking. The weight of the truth was suffocating her. How could she have been so blind? How had she lived with a man who harbored such dark secrets? A loud thud echoed from downstairs. Emily's body tensed, her heart leaping into her throat. She stood up slowly, listening, her pulse pounding in her ears. She strained to hear any other sounds. Michael had been quiet since she'd left him on the couch, lost in his own guilt and remorse. But now, the atmosphere in the house felt different, heavier, darker. Another thud, followed by a muffled noise. Emily's breath caught in her chest. What was he doing? Was he getting up? Coming after her? Her mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. What if he wasn't the broken, remorseful man she'd left downstairs? What if he was something more dangerous now? Desperate, perhaps? She grabbed her suitcase and zipped it up, her movements hurried. She needed to leave immediately. Just as she reached for the doorknob, the sound of footsteps echoed from the staircase. Slow, deliberate steps. Michael was coming upstairs. Panic surged through her veins. She glanced toward the window, considering whether she could escape that way. It was a 2-story drop, but at this point, she was willing to take the risk. Anything to avoid another confrontation with him. "Emily?" Michael's voice called out, eerily calm. She froze, her hand hovering over the doorknob. "Emily, we need to talk." His voice sent chills down her spine. The calmness in his tone felt unnatural, wrong. He sounded almost composed, like he had come to some terrible conclusion and was now at peace with it. I'm leaving, Michael," Emily called back, her voice shaky. "I can't stay here. I can't be with you after what you've done." There was a pause, and the footsteps stopped just outside the door. Emily's heart hammered against her ribs. every muscle in her body taut with fear. "You can't leave, Emily," Michael said softly, his voice barely audible through the door.
You know too much now.
Emily's blood ran cold. The unspoken threat hung in the air like a guillotine blade poised to drop. Her mind scrambled for a way out, for some kind of escape. She couldn't open the door, he was right there. And the window. The drop was too dangerous. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for anything she could use as a weapon. Her gaze fell on the heavy lamp on the bedside table. Without hesitation, she grabbed it, gripping it tightly with both hands as she backed away from the door. Michael's voice came again, more insistent this time. "We can fix this, Emily. I can fix it.
But you need to stay.
You need to stay with me." Her grip tightened on the lamp, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She knew there was no fixing this. There was no going back to the life they had before. Not after what she had learned. Not after everything that had been revealed. The doorknob turned slowly. Emily's heart seized. She took a step back, raising the lamp above her head, ready to strike if he came through that door. The door creaked open, revealing Michael's silhouette in the dim light of the hallway. His face was shadowed, but she could see the intensity in his eyes, the same eyes that had once looked at her with love and devotion, now filled with something far more dangerous. "Put the suitcase down, Emily," Michael said, his voice low and steady. "We're going to fix this. Together." She shook her head, her body trembling with fear and adrenaline.
No, Michael.
"I can't stay with you. I won't." His expression darkened, and for a moment, she thought he might lunge at her. But then, something flickered in his eyes, something cold and calculating. "You don't have a choice," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Emily's breath hitched as he took a slow step into the room, closing the door behind him. She knew in that moment that whatever was about to happen next would change her life forever.